This is Pervez Hoodbhoy, and today's discussion will be about America and the shape of global politics to come. I'm in the office of a person who is recognized as America's leading intellectual. He's also America's leading critic of its foreign policy. I am, of course, with Professor Noam Chomsky. He is at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's been here for 55 years, the author of more than 100 books. He is, in fact, the person who founded modern linguistics, or rather the mathematical structure of linguistics owes to his work done in the 1950s. Professor Chomsky, thanks very much for agreeing to be on this program.
Very glad to be with you.
Professor Chomsky, the United States, after the Cold War, was the only power in sight. There was enormous hubris in the United States. There was the program for the new American century. You had people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and Scooter Libby and so forth, who said, well, now the United States is the only power around. It has no peer, no rival. It can shape the world as it likes. And yet, today, as we see, the US is losing control over its empire. Had you foreseen that this would happen?
In a certain sense, remember that the people you just mentioned are way out at the fringe. There is a spectrum of opinion on foreign policy issues and domestic issues. It's not very broad, but it's not zero. And they were so far out on the fringe that you could barely find them. That's why they came under very considerable criticism right from the mainstream.
So and yet George W. Bush followed their policies.
He did. He happened to be elected, but actually he wasn't elected, but the Supreme Court put him in. At the beginning, his positions were sort of mild. After the 9/11 attacks, there was a very sharp change. Then they thought they had their opportunity, and then they went ahead and invaded Iraq. But if you take a look at the invasion of Iraq, there was very substantial criticism. They were regarded as a dangerous group.
So is this what one should call imperial overstretch?
Well, that became clear very soon. They got themselves into real trouble with first of all, they destroyed Iraq, killed hundreds of thousands of people, spread sectarian conflict throughout the whole region. It was a total disaster. A couple of million refugees. But from the point of view of U.S. power, it was a severe blow. Actually, the U.S. suffered a defeat in Iraq. They don't admit it, but that's what happened.
And perhaps the penalty is that now much of the Middle East is being removed from American control, starting from Tunisia, going on to Egypt, then to Bahrain, Libya, and so on and so forth. So does this represent some drastic change in America and its relationship to the world?
Well, we should, it does, but I think it's useful to look back a little bit. Starting in the 1990s, the U.S. began to lose control of what has always been considered the safe backyard, namely Latin America. South America, which has by now drifted pretty far from U.S. control. That's the first time in 500 years that South America has begun to emancipate it from foreign control.
But let's come back to the Middle East.
Middle East is much more important. If you go back to the Second World War, when the United States was displacing England as the primary world power, there were extensive plans as to how to control the world. And they're worth rereading. This is the Roosevelt administration. It's not far right. Through the Second World War, there were planning sessions. State Department, Council on Foreign Relations, the main extra-governmental input to the foreign policy establishment. They had a group called the War Peace Studies Group, went on for 6 years right through the war. And they laid out plans. They assumed that the United States would emerge from the war in a position of enormous power. The early years, they thought that Germany would survive as a major European power, but after the Russians started driving back the German armies after Stalingrad, they realized that wouldn't be true. They developed the concept of what they called a grand area. Within this grand area, U.S. domination would be total, and no exercise of sovereignty would be permitted in the grand area that conflicts with U.S. design.
Except, of course, for Israel. Now, Israel...
There was no Israel then. This is the early 1940s.
Where would you put the peak of American power?
1945. At that point, the U.S. just reigned supreme. I mean, the Soviet Union was there, but it was minor in comparison.
But then the Soviet Union eventually goes away. But let's come back to the Middle East. Now, U.S. support for Israel has been unstinting.
It's worth looking at that carefully. U.S. support for Israel in the current form was established after 1967. And something happened in 1967, which is quite crucial. Remember the situation in the Middle East then. There was a major conflict going on between radical Islam, based in Saudi Arabia, and secular nationalism, based in Egypt. Actually, there's a proxy war going on between them in the Yemen. The U.S. and Britain strongly supported radical Islam.
These revolutions have consumed so much of the Middle East, and now the U.S. power over there is on the wane. So isn't this a consequence of the support that the U.S. had given to Israel?
I think it's a small element of it, but here too we have to pay careful attention to what the reasoning has been. I mean, as far back as let's go back to the 1950s, before Israel was a major issue. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower was concerned with what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Middle East, not among the governments, but among the people. And the National Security Council, the major planning agency, came out with a memorandum in 1958 which explained it. It said there's a perception in the Middle East, in the Arab world, that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictators and blocks democracy and development, and that we do that because we want to gain control over their energy resources. And it said, furthermore, the perception is fairly accurate, and that's what we should be doing.
So what do you see as the future of the Middle East? After all these revolutions settle down, what are the alternative forces that are going to come in and determine the future of Arab societies in the, let's say, the next decade?
Well, that's very much open. Read this morning's New York Times. There's a discussion of the position that the United States government should take and what it is taking. They say the U.S. should pick the winners. As long as the dictators are controlling the populations, it's fine to support them. If things get out of control, you have to adjust tactics. And how it will turn out is very unclear. But it's important to recognize that the United States and Europe cannot support democracy in the Middle East. And it's enough to see why. It's enough to look at Arab public.
So in other words, you don't see any difference in essence between the policies of Richard Nixon onwards until Obama?
Nixon was the last liberal president, hasn't been one since. And whatever you think about him, he was a kind of a statesman, had a conception of world affairs. But the differences are pretty slight. But the crucial point, I think, is that...
And yet, President Obama is coming out strongly in support for the revolution that's sweeping across.
Absolutely not. He's been very hesitant, said very little. People are very angry about it.
About Libya,
Libya, he said almost nothing. There's partly part of the reason for that is that there's still diplomats trapped there, so he can't say much. Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Chun in South Korea, and Suharto in Indonesia, a long series. And there's a standard reaction. Support the dictator as long as possible. If it becomes impossible, maybe the army turns against him.
Professor Chomsky, if I may, let's turn to a different aspect of US policy and what it is likely to become in the years ahead. It is in strong competition today with China. China is the emerging superpower, at least in economic terms, if not militarily, although militarily too, it's now building up quite a bit. Let's assume for the moment that that China was to take the place of the United States as being the most powerful nation on earth in terms of its corporations, its companies being all over the world, the yuan being the world currency instead of the dollar, policing being done by Chinese forces rather than US forces. What would be the shape of that world? Would it be a better world, do you think, than that dominated by the United States?
I don't think it would, but the possibility is so remote, it's hardly worth talking about. Let's take a careful, I mean, there's a lot of inflated talk about this, but let's take a look at the facts. Take a look at the Human Development Index, UN Human Development Index. China is approximately 90th. India, the other great power, is about 120th. These are very poor countries. GDP per capita in China, according to the World Bank, is maybe 10% of the US. That's probably actually higher, maybe 20%. They have enormous internal problems. China has extreme inequality. There are tens of thousands of labor struggles every year, even according to official statistics. China is, at the moment, primarily an assembly plant. You take a look at the trade deficit of the United States with China that everyone talks about. There's a big trade deficit.
Okay, but if you were to look at statistics put out by, let's say, Goldman Sachs, they make predictions of where China's GDP will be, where India's will be, and where the United States will be. And there's going to be a crossover point, I think, in 2025, unless I'm mistaken. So the GDP of the Chinese is going to exceed that of the United States.
The relevant question is GDP per capita. You know, GDP in itself doesn't mean much. Furthermore, if you take a look at it, right now, it'll change over time. But for the moment, Chinese production is mostly foreign-based.
Agreeing with what you said, nevertheless, if you take China and India together, they are definitely producing, they will be producing much more wealth than the United States.
No.
They will
because the wealth
also
that
be major players in determining the politics of the countries around them. Then there's Europe, which is an alternate center of power. All this means is that the US will not have that preeminent position that it once had. How is this going to reflect upon the global international order? It's certainly not going to be that of the post-Cold War era.
But that, as I say again, that's a steady process since 1945. By the early 1970s, the world was already tripolar economically. That was the term that was used. There's a North American area, there's a German-based European area. There was, at that time, a Japan-based Asian area. Now it's Japan, China-based Asian area. And it's been expanding, and now the world is even more diverse. The leading problem, and what's going to lead to the decline of the United States, in my opinion, is not so much the rise of China and India, which is, it's there, but I don't think it's that significant. It's internal. The United States internally is becoming a kind of a third world power.
It was once the source of all technology, or most innovative technology. It had, a population that was very well educated, informed.
The 1950s and the 1960s were the biggest growth period in American history. In fact, that's where a lot of the technology comes from. In fact, comes from right where we're sitting.
Okay, so we see the decline of the US because its internal economy is no longer able to sustain that kind of growth which is essential for it to be the dominant world power. Today we see the United States mired down in conflicts across the globe, but particularly in Afghanistan. What is your prescription for the solution of Afghanistan? Is it instant American withdrawal?
No, I think what has to be done is U.S. planners and the military understand that they're not going to win a military victory. They don't want to withdraw with something that looks like a defeat. So they have to find some palatable way to pull out. Now that has to be a regional settlement. First of all, it has to be a regional settlement externally, but internally there has to be some kind of negotiations among Afghans. and the Taliban, whether we like it or not, are Afghans.
Professor Chomsky, there's been an enormous deterioration in the relations between Muslims and the West. We've seen this after 1979, where there were two events. One was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the US and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia get together to launch the great global jihad, and then the consequences that follow from that. And 1979 is also the Iranian Revolution. What do you think is the direction of relations between Muslims considered as a whole and the United States and Europe?
There certainly have been changes, but I think the continuities are more striking. I mentioned it before. Long before this, in 1950s, the US, British, French policy was that as long as our favored dictators control the population, we don't care what they think. There can be a campaign of hatred, and we don't care. We'll rely on the dictators. That is exactly the position held today, not just by governments, but even by the general intellectual culture.
Professor Chomsky, there's a lot to be discussed, and I'd like to pick your brains for hours, but we have to move towards the end. I want to ask you, what are the principles that should govern the relations between nations? Is it, well, you've been very critical of the United States, and justly so in many cases, but after all, it's not just the US which has been nasty to the world and to peoples around. It's also been practically every other country. There are countries which have performed genocide upon other populations. Is this the beast within man? Is it our inability as human beings to live together? What is it that makes us so incapable of living together in peace?
Well, I don't think we're so incapable of living together in peace. In fact, there's a lot of progress too. Take, say, Europe. For centuries, Europe was the most brutal and savage place in the world. French and Germans had no higher goal than to slaughter one another. It was a violent place, Europe, for centuries, while state formation was taking place. In fact, that's how Europe developed the culture and technology of savagery that enabled it to conquer the world. Well, that changed.
So you have an optimistic view of human nature, that somehow we can transcend the kind of propaganda that each one of us is subject to in our different environments. You've been primarily a critic of the US, and you're recognized as such across the world. But what is the message that you really want to give to peace activists, to those who want to struggle for a better society in their own respective environments? Is it to be against America, or is it to be against what?
Against power. Against power and the institutions in which power is based. So I happen to have been writing for the last 50, 60 years when the United States has been the dominant global power. Furthermore, I'm in the United States. I can, to some extent, influence actions taken in the United States. I can't influence what happens in Iran or China. So just on elementary moral grounds, of course, I focus on the United States, plus on geopolitical grounds. But if I was living in France right now, I'd be focusing on French crime, for example.
If you were living in Pakistan?
Pakistan, I'd be trying to do what you're doing. I mean, the problems of Pakistan are very severe. I don't have to, you can tell me more than I can tell you. Pakistan's a very dangerous country for reasons not unrelated to U.S. policies. As you mentioned before, the Saudi-U.S. involvement with Zia-ul-Haq kind of set off the global jihadi movement, which is no joke. But inside Pakistan, I hate to, my feeling at least, limited information, is that there ought to be major efforts in Pakistan to try to implement something like the 1973 Constitution, which allowed for a degree of autonomy among the separate regions. Pakistan's pretty artificial, and a radical shift back in the educational system towards secularism and against religious fanaticism. and also elimination, sharp reduction, finally elimination of the nuclear system, and the crazy strategic doctrine which says that Pakistan has to match India in military force and can't do it in any other way, has to exceed India in nuclear power, nuclear weapons. All of this has to be radically changed. And those are problems internal to Pakistan. I can't do anything about them. You can and do.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. It was a pleasure.